Cool, welcome everyone. Today's speaker is Vincent Conitzer. He's a computer scientist who is also known for putting his work in dialogue with fields like economics and operations research and philosophy, among others. He has conducted and advised research in topics such as decision theory, game theory, computational economics, and more. And his research concerns things like theoretical foundations of AI, the economic aspects of AI systems, as well as the relevance of idealized models of when thinking about the future of AI systems. He has a new research group called Focal, which focuses on the foundations of cooperative behavior in current and future AI systems. And his talk today is titled, AI agents might cooperate better if they don't resemble us. And that's it for me. I'll let you take it away, Vincent. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's not a very big group, so please feel free to interject questions. I know people are coming from very different backgrounds. So also, if something is not clear, please feel free to interrupt me. And I'll try to, it will get a little bit technical at some point, but I'm hoping to make most of it very accessible. Okay. So the premise of the talk is that as AI systems control more and more of our world, they will inevitably at some point start to run into each other. So they will start to interact with each other without necessarily being mediated by human beings. And when that happens, what can we expect to happen? Well, one thing we might be worried about is that we get what I'll call tragedies of algorithmic interaction, that due to the way they interact, we get unexpectedly bad outcomes. And I'll show some examples of that in a little while. Now, some of those examples will rely maybe on the fact that the agents, in fact, aren't all that intelligent, right? So maybe it's more of an issue of artificial stupidity. But I think in the long run, what we would expect to see is that maybe we do get these kind of tragedies, but not because the systems aren't intelligent enough, but because they pursue different objectives. And so what ends up happening is that we see game-theoretic tragedies, such as the tragedy of the commons or the prisoner's dilemma. I'm hoping some of you are already familiar with these ideas, but so we'll see the prisoner's dilemma in just a little bit. So those are situations where outcomes are reached that are worse for everybody, in spite of the fact that the individual agents are rational, but the issue is that they pursue their own objectives and they are in conflict with each other. Given this, we also would like to make sure that that doesn't happen and that we in fact get to more cooperative outcomes. Traditional game theorists have thought about this for a long time, and we see humans cooperating, at least in many settings. And so what is the explanation of that in traditional game theory? Well, typically there's a story about repeated games and maybe reputation. So I'm interested in those stories to the extent that we can use those kinds of techniques to get AI systems to be more cooperative. That's wonderful. But I'm also interested in ways in which AI systems are fundamentally unlike us as human beings, and the ways in which we might be able to leverage that in order to make them more cooperative. And as a quick preview of this, one of the kinds of things I'll have in mind is that AI agents might be able to read each other's source code. That is something that doesn't really seem to have a human analog, but that can be very helpful in cooperation. And yet I would argue that in spite of the fact that we all realize that AI systems are not exactly like us, in kind of the traditional AI literature, to some extent, we've been trained to think of designing AI agents to resemble us, right? That's the typical model we have of an agent is really quite anthropomorphic, that we try to make it resemble us in various ways. And that's to some extent the way we've been taught to think. And maybe we need to get away from that a little bit. And so to illustrate that, here on the right-hand side of the slide, I have this little story that by now probably you've already read. But here the idea is there are two self-driving cars that are able to communicate with each other. And so the orange car says, it pulls up behind the green one and says, hey, if I tailgate you, that means like drive really close behind you, is your occupant going to take back control and pull over? Now you have to understand, if you're a self-driving car, that is a very bad thing to happen to you. That's a total loss of face. You don't want your occupant to take back control. So the green car responds somewhat nervously, what makes you think I would tell you? And the orange car says, hi, you're nervous. You like, now I know. You just told me. I better move aside. And the green car says, you're bluffing. The orange car says, maybe. Were you willing to take the chance? So this story is supposed to be a little bit funny. I don't know if it's very funny, but if it's funny, to the extent that it's funny because at some level, we really don't expect self-driving cars to behave this way. All right. That's not how we really would expect these systems to be designed. And yet again, as I'll argue, this is to some extent how we've been trained to think, and AI is actually very much like this picture. Good. Okay, there's some resources on the left. As Nora already said, I'm about to, well, currently I'm in Oxford. I have a part-time appointment in Oxford, but I've been at Duke for the last 16 years, which have been wonderful, and Duke has been a great institution for me. But I'm also excited to now start at CMU in the fall, also where I did my PhD, and start the Foundations of Cooperative AI lab. And in some ways, you can think of this talk as an introduction to what we'll do in the lab. Great. Okay, so let's go on to an outline of the talk. So first, I'll give some examples of what I'll call these tragedies of algorithmic interaction. Then I'll go to this topic of rethinking the design of intelligent agents, and particularly to move away from the traditional model that I would argue is somewhat anthropomorphic. And along the way, I'll also argue that even if we have highly intelligent systems, and even if those individual systems are very close to aligned in terms of our values, due to game theoretic reasons, we can still get horrible outcomes. And so that's the kind of thing we want to address in this talk. Then I'll have a little bit of an interlude. Having established that AI cooperation is important, you can ask the question of, should they cooperate in the ways that human beings do, or should they cooperate in different ways? And so I'll discuss that a little bit. Then I'll talk about more traditional game theoretic techniques for achieving cooperation in these kind of settings like the prisoner's dilemma. And then I'll talk about some such techniques that actually don't really seem to work for human beings, and that consequently have maybe been ignored, or maybe only appear in relatively obscure places in the philosophy literature, but that could actually be very useful to us. And I'll close hopefully with some open questions and a call to action. All right, so let's start with the tragedies of algorithmic interaction. So here's a fun example. So there was this book called The Making of a Fly, The Genetics of Animal Design, which was for sale on Amazon at some point. And I'm sure it's a wonderful book, but something funny happened here, where there were two sellers selling new copies of the book, Prof. Nath and Bordy Book. And for some reason, this book was selling for around $2 million US. Again, I'm sure it's a wonderful book, but there doesn't seem to be any particular reason that it should be selling for $2 million. In particular, you can see over here, the used price is like $35. So what happened here? There doesn't seem to be any particular reason that these prices should be so high. Now, there was actually a Berkeley postdoc that I think maybe was interested in the book that recognized that this was happening, and eventually also figured out what really was happening. And in fact, you saw the price went up quite a bit more. Eventually, it was almost $24 million. And so what was happening was that the two sellers were both using algorithmic pricing. So if you look here at the bottom of the slide, let's see if I can click on the bottom of the slide. Yes. You see that what Prof. Nath, one of the sellers, was doing was it was always just slightly undercutting its competitor. It wanted to be the cheapest seller. And so it took whatever its competitor's price was and multiplied it by 0.998. Interestingly, Bordy Book, the other seller, had a different strategy and actually multiplied the price of its competitor, so Prof. Nath, by 1.27, so by actually a number greater than 1. Not totally clear what the reason is. Maybe maybe Bordy Book wanted to be seen as a higher quality seller, or maybe what Bordy Book was doing was they didn't actually have the book in stock and just bet on the fact that they would be able to buy the book from the other seller to then sell it again to the buyer at a markup. Whatever the reason, because of the fact that the one number is so much closer to one than the other, you can see what would happen here. If you repeatedly update the prices this way, you actually get an exponential increase in the prices as we saw. So that was the reason for the price is getting completely out of hand. Now, this is mostly a funny example, and no real harm done. Presumably, nobody actually went and bought the book for $24 million. And eventually, the prices came back down as this was realized. But it does illustrate that algorithmic interaction can be somewhat unexpected, lead to unexpected phenomena. Here's a somewhat more serious example. And this is in 2010, there was the flash crash. This here is the Dow Jones, which suddenly took a huge hit for no apparent fundamental reason. And I think even today, people don't really exactly know all the details of what happened. But one thing that is very clear is that algorithmic trading, so here you see HFTs are high frequency traders, so those are trading by algorithm. They played a big role in this sudden crash. And in particular, one thing that ended up happening was that these algorithms were selling things to each other back and forth in what they called the hot potato effect, that nobody seemed to want to hold these assets. And as a consequence, the price rapidly dropped. Eventually, things went back to normal. But this is certainly a more serious example where this could really have significant societal consequences. This time it was okay, but that's the kind of concern. Now, in both of these examples, again, you might say, well, the issue here is just that the systems aren't intelligent enough. Clearly, the two Amazon sellers did not use very sophisticated algorithms. In the flash crash case, maybe it's a little bit harder to argue that the algorithms weren't very smart, but obviously some people here lost a lot of money, and it doesn't seem like this kind of hot potato effect is necessarily very rational. But as I said, in the long run, we would worry that, well, maybe the systems are intelligent, but they end up pursuing different objectives, and so we run into game-theoretic tragedies. And again, combining that with the fact that the AI systems are going to control more and more of our world, that I think is something really to worry about, right? Imagine this kind of thing happening in a military context, for example. Okay, good. So those are some examples. So now let's come back to this idea of rethinking how we design intelligent agents, artificially intelligent agents. And just to give some background, this is what I would say is the traditional view in the AI community of what an AI agent is and should be. This is from Russell and Norvig, AI, A Modern Approach, which is arguably the main AI textbook in the world. It's a somewhat older version, and so what I'm about to say doesn't really reflect Stewart's current thinking, and so I'll come back to that in a second. But this is kind of, I think it's a good presentation of the traditional view of an agent in AI. And again, it's somewhat anthropomorphic. It's very close to the economic theory idea of an agent. So what do we have? We have an agent here, which is this well-delimited modular entity that perceives the environment through some kind of sensors. It has a model of what the world is like. It has a model of how the world evolves over time. And it also has a model of its own actions and how those affect how the world evolves over time. On top of that, it has something that we'll call a utility function or an objective function, sometimes just preferences over the state of the world, that will allow it to consider certain courses of action, certain outcomes better than others. From that, it can then conclude what action it should take, and it has some kind of effectors, some way of interacting with the environment, of affecting the environment that it can then use. Okay, that's the setting. And then there's this question about where does this utility come from? And the traditional AI literature doesn't really say a whole lot about it. Typically, it says, well, somebody is going to tell us what the objective function is. Maybe our job is to make our algorithms work with any objective function, and then somebody else will fill in the details, right? So I think both parts of this slide, both the left and the right-hand side, have come under pressure as we think about today's AI systems already. And in particular, this part on the right of the objective somehow being handed to us, that's something that's been getting a lot of attention. And again, like Stuart Russell and his group have done a lot of great work thinking about how you should think about it instead of thinking of giving the system an objective function. Maybe you want it to be uncertain about the objective function. A lot of wonderful work there. In this talk also, I'll try to put a little bit of criticism on the left-hand side of the picture. And again, I'll argue that even with today's AI systems, this part of the picture is coming under pressure, right? Even if you think of a personal assistant on your phone, right? Let's say you have Siri on your phone, on an iPhone. If you think of Siri on your iPhone, is that an agent? Or is do you have your copy of Siri and is that one agent and I have my copy, which is a different agent? Or is all of Siri together across all the resources that it uses, is that sort of one big agent? And if you think about this for a little bit, you'll see obvious downsides to each way of thinking, right? There isn't really kind of a clear delimitation of where one agent ends and one begins. Okay, so we'll come back to that, but let's first focus on this right-hand side of the objective function. And that, of course, is what what is often considered value alignment, or in sort of a little bit of a, I'm going to interpret that slightly narrowly here. I'll come back to that in a second. But maybe many of you have already heard about this kind of work. And I would say the alignment problem and the work that's done on it takes many different forms in different communities. I've done quite a bit of work on doing this in kidney exchanges. So kidney exchanges are a place where AI algorithms are already used to decide which kidney donors to match to which patients that need to receive a kidney. And there's an interesting question there of what should the objective function be? Do you just want to maximize the number of transplants that take place? Or do you want to maybe prioritize certain people over others, people for whom it's urgent, people that have a long life left ahead of them if they do get the kidney, people that have dependents? You can see how this would very quickly get controversial. And so that's something that we've been working on for quite a bit. More broadly, right, there's just lots of communities thinking about how to make AI work in a way that we think is good for society. Since I'm in Oxford right now, I'll advertise the AIES conference that we'll have in a little over a week now. So if you're nearby, you can still make it. And that will be here at Oxford. There's also the FACT conference here at Oxford. I'm also affiliated with the Institute for Ethics in AI. There's the 100-year study on artificial intelligence. So many entities are thinking about this question. For the purpose of today's talk, though, what I want to focus on is another problem, right? That's even if you align the individual's agents almost perfectly, you can still get really bad outcomes. And so here is an example of that. This is not a real world example like the ones we saw before, but this is just an illustrative example. Imagine that we have two agents, two AI agents, that together provide a service. So each provides a part of that service, and each of the agents has to choose the quality with which it provides that service, Q sub I. Right? So Q sub I is the quality that agent I provides. And then the overall quality of the service is only as good as the weaker parts. Okay, so whichever number of quality is chosen that's lower, that's what's going to determine the overall quality of the service. We as humanity, let's say, care about that. We care about the overall quality of the service. And let's say we've done a pretty good job on aligning the individual agents so that each agent cares primarily also about this overall quality. But I did say they're not exactly aligned. So let's say that they each have a slightly different incentive. So they have a slight incentive to be the one with the lower quality, right? For example, maybe whichever agent has the lower quality right now, maybe we give that one some special attention to try to get the quality up, and maybe that agent in some sense likes that. So let's say they have just a slight incentive to be the lower one, on top of mostly caring about the overall quality. Now we're going to write this as a game. So here's a discretized version of the game. I recognize not everybody may have a background in game theory. So very quickly, what this means is agent one, we're going to think of as choosing a row, agent two as choosing a column. And so in the blue entry, you see what number they pick. Again, we've discretized it from 0 to 100 by 10. And then once they each make their choice, like let's say that the row agent chooses 90 and the column agent chooses 80, that leads us to some entry. So here that's 80, 102. And those two numbers give the utilities of the two different agents, right? So the row agent is a little bit less happy because the row agent is not the lower one, and the column agent is the lower one, so it gets a little bit higher utility. But for the most part, their utility is determined by the lower of the two numbers. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. We'll see some simpler games in just a second, but hopefully that already makes some sense. Now, what I want you to take away from this game, so there's lots of numbers here. Don't try to read every single number, but I hope you trust me that this corresponds to the game that I just told you about. So what to take away from it? First of all, within every entry, so every outcome of this game, the two players' utilities are quite close. By the way, the two players here are the two agents. There's also maybe us as humanity, and we care about just the lower number. But so in any case, all three of those numbers are always actually quite close together. So here they can differ by 22 at most. If I discretize it more finely, I can get them as close to each other as I want while still having this phenomenon. Okay, so that's the first thing to notice. The second thing to notice is that, of course, in the end, we'd like to end up here in the upper left corner, right? That's where the utilities are really high. If they both pick a high quality, then we get a high overall quality. But now in game theory, we think about equilibria. Where do things strategically end up? It turns out this game has only a single equilibrium, and unfortunately, it is all the way down in the bottom right-hand corner. So somehow, even though both agents collectively, they have this incentive to work together and get high utilities, if they strategically pursue their own interests, the only place you will end up is over here, where everybody's utility is really, really bad. Okay, and that also means any reasonable learning process, like something minimizing regret, will eventually converge down here. This game, by the way, has a name in the literature. It's called the Traveler's Dilemma, and usually comes with a different story. But so that's kind of our motivating example here. Okay. So now I said the individual systems are in some sense well aligned. You could argue that the overall system consisting of both agents together is not very well aligned because it ends up in these bad outcomes, right? So that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And that's what we're going to be thinking about. How do you get these self-interested agents with different objective functions still to cooperative outcomes? Okay, so that was a fairly complex game. For the rest of the talk, as a running example, for the most part, we'll just have the prisoner's dilemma, which you may have seen before. But this is how the prisoner's dilemma works. We have a red agent and a blue agent, and each of them has to choose an action. Choose either cooperate or defect. Okay, so if you defect, you try to take advantage of the other player. Both agents are better off cooperating. They'll both get a utility of 2. Then they are both defecting. Then they'll both get a utility of 1. And yet, and this is the key part of the prisoner's dilemma, if you think from an individual perspective, you would say, well, if I'm the red agent, I can think in different cases. I can say, well, if the blue agent cooperates, if I cooperate, I get 2, but if I defect, I even get 3, right? And so the idea is for, the agents are going to pursue their own utility. So in that case, the red agent would be better off defecting. And if the blue agent defects, then also the red agent is better off defecting, right? Because 1 is bigger than 0. Okay. And so the same thing is actually true for the blue agent, that the blue agent is better off defecting than cooperating, regardless of what the red agent is doing. And in game theory, this is called a dominant strategy. Both players have a dominant strategy to defect. And as a result, they actually do end up here if they follow their dominant strategies. And so even though that's worse for both of them, that is in some sense the strategically rational outcome. So we'll come back to that later on. Any questions so far? This is kind of the setting, right? This is the game theory we're going to be thinking about. Okay, time for a little interlude. Should AI systems cooperate like human beings do? If you go on the web and you enter the right search query, you can find lots of articles about how wonderful and special human cooperation really is. You see here, just the headlines suggest that there's something really special about humanity and that we're so good at cooperating. Of course, it all depends on how you enter that search query. If you enter it somewhat differently, you can find lots of articles on how horrible we are at cooperating. So here are some examples going all the way from world wars to climate change and so on, even the pandemic. Okay, it's kind of interesting that these examples where things go wrong tend to be kind of examples of global cooperation, right? And not on very small scales, because we're maybe more wired to cooperate in small groups. Okay, so in some sense, the jury is out on how good humans are at cooperating. So if we want AI systems to be cooperative, should we make them more human-like? And if so, how should we do that? And so you can think about, maybe we should make our agents have some pro-social inclinations or some kind of ethics, right? That they will pursue ethically good actions or altruistic actions and so on. So that is an interesting approach. And I changed my mind about how I think about that, right? Because sometimes I see papers and they argue that, well, here's a context in which our agents face some kind of dilemma, like a prisoner's dilemma kind of situation. And if only we change the objective functions a little bit, actually, they reach a much better outcome collectively. And in some sense, that seems like a useful result. And in another way, I worry that in some cases that will just be wishful thinking, that yes, if our agents had a different utility function, things would have been much better, but maybe it's already too late, right? Or it also maybe depends a little bit on where these objective functions come from, if they're evolved, who knows? So I don't want to rely just on hoping that everybody will design their agents to have these pro-social inclinations, though, of course, to some extent, that might be a good thing. A variant, though, is to think about norms and rules to set for these agents and think about institutions, right? That I think is a little bit different, and that's potentially a useful way to proceed, right? That even relatively selfish human beings face lots of incentives to cooperate because of the norms and rules that we apply. Another point is we might argue that some human cognitive limitations, as we all have, actually limit some of these tragedies. And then there's an interesting question of should and are we even able to replicate that in AI agents? For example, the game I just showed you before, the bigger game, The Traveler's Dilemma, it is well known that human beings, when you get them to play that game, they usually actually won't play the equilibrium. They'll play generally much larger numbers than that. Even game theorists, if you get them to play this game, will play much larger numbers than that. And it's an interesting question of what is exactly going on there. And one of the things that may be going on there is that it requires a lot of levels of reasoning to argue your way all the way to that horrible equilibrium in that particular game. And humans typically just don't do that many levels of reasoning. And in particular, also for in the Traveler's Dilemma, you would have to be very confident that your opponent is doing a similar level of reasoning, and that you would also have to be confident that they're confident that you're doing it. And so human beings at some point usually just kind of shortcut that and say, well, I'll just pick a large number. How much can I really lose? But of course, there is the concern that maybe AI agents won't feel so restricted, right? And they really can easily think through the entire game. I think there's a broader story here that's not just a particular game like The Traveler's Dilemma, but there's a broader story that I tried to kind of illustrate with the quote below, which is that for most of our lives, most of the time, we're just kind of doing what we're supposed to do, right? We have some standard way of proceeding. I get on the bus, I make my way over, and we're just not constantly thinking of all the different ways in which we could somehow take advantage of the situation. That would be completely exhausting if you were constantly looking for every single way of taking advantage of the situation that you were in, right? And so we don't bother to always be thinking strategically to take advantage of the situation. Again, there's a concern that AI systems maybe don't have that limitation. But what I really want to focus on in this talk, of course, is the bottom bullet here. Could AI do better on cooperation than human beings? Maybe this would actually somehow naturally already happen with sufficiently advanced AI systems, but we'll think more about, are there deliberate design decisions that we can make in our AI systems that will facilitate that? Okay, so let's get on with that. So now we're going to go through a little bit more game theory. And first think of some traditional ways of achieving cooperation. And this is maybe the canonical way of getting to cooperation in game theory, which is through repetition of the game. This is an argument that any good game theorist will give to say that, well, look, the reason that we don't constantly defect on each other is that we don't have these just one-off interactions most of the time. Most of the time, we will interact with the same person again and again. And that actually gives you a way to get to cooperation, because you don't want to defect on the person, because that will destroy the ability to cooperate in the future. Okay, that's an intuition, but you can actually make that formal. Because now, if you're playing an infinitely repeated game, you need to have a strategy for the repeated game, which means a strategy that tells you at every point in the repeated game, based on what happened so far, what will you do next? One strategy is, it's called the Grim Trigger strategy. And it says the following. It says, okay, my strategy is to cooperate as long as everybody so far has cooperated. But if, for example, the other player defects at some point, then I'm completely out. I will defect forever. No way to get me back to cooperating. Seems particularly harsh and extreme. But if you think about it, this is actually an equilibrium of the game, meaning that if both players play this, then neither player would want to deviate from that equilibrium. Right? If I know that the other player is playing Grim Trigger, then I want to keep cooperating with that agent, because I don't want to get to the part where we defect forever. And if somehow we did start to defect, well, then the best I can do is just keep defecting. And so actually the Grim Trigger strategy is a best response to itself. This doesn't work only for the prisoner's dilemma, but really it works in some sense for any game. There's something known as the Folk Theorem that makes that precise. Interestingly, actually, the Folk Theorem, at least some versions of the Folk Theorem, allow for more efficient computation of equilibria as well. That's sort of a nice side benefit. Okay, so are we done? Have we solved the issue of cooperation? I would say no. So in some cases, this works. Of course, we've already seen that in some cases, human beings don't get the cooperation. And so why would this not work? Well, for example, if you don't think there's enough chance to interact with the same person in the future again, if you don't care enough about the future, right, or if it's going to take long enough until you interact with the same person again relative to how much you care about the future, then this argument may not work. You may not care enough about the future cooperation to then not defect right now. By the way, there's another way in which you might suffer from defecting, which is that maybe I'm playing with person A, and let's say I defect on person A, knowing that I won't interact with person A anymore. But then person A, at some later point, talks with person B and says, boy, Vince really defected on me. Don't trust Vince. And then later again, I actually have to interact with B, and now B won't cooperate with me anymore. Right? So that kind of a network effect can also help to sustain cooperation. I'm motivated by that with former econ PhD student Catherine Moon at Duke. We worked on repeated games on social networks, which had exactly this aspect that if you defect on someone, eventually knowledge of that is going to propagate through the network and come back to bite you. But it takes a while potentially. And so in this context, we found an algorithm for finding the maximal set of cooperating agents. So what is the biggest set of agents that you can get to cooperate with each other in equilibrium? Once we had that algorithm, I'll skip the details of that, we could also run experiments with it. And in particular, we were interested in experiments on randomly generated graphs with various parameters. And so now we were curious, as you vary something like the discount factor, which represents how much you care about the future, or the benefit of cooperation, what will happen to the size of the set of cooperating agents? And I figured, well, if you increase the discount factor so people care or agents care more about the future, then gradually that size will increase in size. But I was wrong about that, at least in terms of the word gradually. So here's what actually ended up happening in our experiments. So here you see delta is the discount factor, how much agents care about the future. Beta is the cooperation benefit. And so what ends up happening is that for some values of the parameters, actually for lots of values of the parameters, things are going along great, right? Everywhere in this sort of bottom right part, almost nobody is ever defecting. Very rare to see defection. But the scary thing is you might be just about here. I hope you can see my pointer. You might be just about here, and you might think everything is going along great, and a slight change in the value of beta or delta will suddenly get you to, I want to say fall off a cliff, but I should have drawn it the other way around so that you would actually fall off the cliff. Because here we're falling up the cliff. But you might suddenly get into this space where everybody is defecting on each other all the time. So this says that cooperation can be very fragile, right? You might think everything is going along great, and a slight change in circumstances causes things to fall apart completely. So that's a somewhat depressing slide in some ways, but so what I take away from that is that we shouldn't rely just on this way of getting to cooperation. So let's think of some other ways. Here's work with my former student, Yuan Deng, who is now at Google. And in this work, we thought about disarmament. So there's, of course, the kind of regular concept of disarmament. Here we thought about it in a very game-theoretic sense. And to illustrate this, I need a slightly more complex game than the prisoner's dilemma. So here's a more complicated game. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through what the story behind this game is, but just it's a 3x3 game. So there's 2 players that either choose a row or a column. And if you analyze this game, it turns out to have these 2 equilibria, and they're not very good outcomes. 0 and -4 utility for the players. You can play around a little bit with the equilibrium concept. In particular, if you allow one player to commit to a strategy, that doesn't really help in this game. You still just get these these outcomes. But it turns out that there's another kind of commitment that can help here. So instead of committing to play a strategy before the other player moves, you can also commit not to play a particular strategy. So how does that help us? By the way, this over here would be a much better outcome to get to, right? So we're going to try to get over there. So suppose the column player commits not to play the second column, right? And so this is why we call it disarmament. In some sense, the column player has disarmed himself of the second column, okay? Now, at this point, if we play the game right now, still this bad outcome is the only equilibrium. But the point of this is that at this point, now that the middle column is gone, it gives the row player an incentive. So she now has an incentive to remove her top row. And once that happens, only the good equilibrium, or only the good outcome, is in fact the only equilibrium of this game. Okay. And the key thing here is that not only is this outcome now an equilibrium of the game, but if you think about the kind of larger game in which you can take these disarmament steps, this whole sequence of events is in fact an equilibrium of that larger game. Okay, so that's a nice way to get to cooperation as well, I think. But it also has its drawbacks. In particular, first of all, actually, you notice I needed a fairly complicated game to even illustrate this. So in lots of games, this doesn't work. This doesn't work in just the prisoner's dilemma, for example. Also, even to check whether this can work or to compute a schedule by which to disarm, in general, is a computationally hard problem. So NP hard means that we don't currently think that there are good algorithms for this problem that would always solve it fast. So those are the downsides. It turns out a lot of these things go away if what you can remove is mixed strategies. A mixed strategy in game theory is a probability distribution over outcomes. So if you can commit not to play according to particular probability distributions, you can get around this. That seems like a very weird idea. Like, why does that help? what does it even mean to commit not to play according to certain distributions? It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, at least in a human context. But I'll argue later that in an AI context, that can make sense. Finally, I'll talk briefly about ethics. So here's yet a different game. I'll call this the parking game. It's, again, a different story for a well-known game called the trust game. In the parking game, there are two cars, self-driving if you want, or you can have them human operated, it'll be the same. They're both looking for a parking spot. And so the orange car is ahead. This brown car here is about to pull out. Maybe somebody is loading it up with groceries. It's clear that it's going to leave pretty soon, but it hasn't quite left yet. So the orange car is waiting here, and then this green car pulls up behind it. And now the key thing here is that the green car is stuck. Right, so I apologize for my drawing. This red thing here is supposed to be a wall. So the green car is stuck. And now these yellow lines over here mean that the orange car could briefly go there, but it's not allowed to park there. So what would be nice is if the orange car quickly pulled over here, said, hey, green car, you can go past me so you can keep looking for a spot, but don't steal the brown car spot. Like, that's my spot, right? The downside or the risk is that the green car says, actually, I'll take the brown car spot. Thank you very much, right? And the orange car might worry that that's going to happen, and as a result, not get out of the way, which makes everybody less happy. Here's a way to model that. So this is what's known as an extensive form game in game theory. So it's not like the matrices that we saw before. First, the orange car has to decide whether to wait or move aside. And then the green car, well, if the orange car waits, then the green car is just stuck, so it has no decision to make. But if the orange car moves aside, then the green car has a choice to either steal the spot or to go past, right? Okay, so if the orange car waits, orange car gets the spot, that's worth 3, and the green car is stuck and has a utility of 0. Much better for everybody would be if the orange car moved aside and the green car got the pass. That way, the green car can find a spot somewhere else. So that's a utility of 1, let's say. And let's say that also makes the orange car a little bit happier to not have another car stuck behind it. However, the green car can also choose to steal the spot, in which case the green car ends up with 3 for getting the spot, and now the orange car has nothing. And the traditional game theoretic analysis of this game would be that, well, at this point, if the green car gets to act, the green car will steal the spot because that's better for the green car. And the orange car at the first move will anticipate that that will happen. So the orange car says, well, if I move aside, I'm going to end up with 0, so I better just wait. And so we end up at this outcome that's worse for everybody than this outcome over here. And so that's unfortunate, right? That's the kind of thing we try to avoid in cooperative AI. And you might, in this case, argue that there's really something morally wrong about what the green car is doing if it steals the spot, right? Imagine the orange car saying to the green car, hey, I'll get out of the way for you, but don't steal the brown car spot, right? I'm doing this just so you can find a spot somewhere else. That's better for both of us. And the green car says, yeah, I promise not to do that. And then eventually the green car steals the spot anyway. That just feels morally wrong, right? In a normative sense. So there's an interesting question of whether we can have these kind of normative solution concepts in game theory that reflect ethics, and we've done some work on that as well. Again, maybe there's a question I asked earlier about, is this wishful thinking that agents will be designed this way? But I kind of appreciate any tool we can get. All right. Now, all these things, I think, make sense in human contexts. So now I want to move on to things that seem a little bit more foreign in human contexts, but that may work quite well for AI. Meanwhile, is there any question right now? Let me see how I'm. No questions? Okay, good. So let's move on. So just to illustrate the ways in which AI systems that could be different from us that would be relevant here. Here we'll list some examples. What if you knew that others could read your code? How should you act? Again, this feels like a strange question for human beings, or maybe for, like, you can imagine somebody scanning your brain as you're making a decision, not a situation that we usually encounter. Or what if you knew you were facing someone running the exact same code, who always makes decisions the exact same way that you do? Again, for human beings, that's kind of hard to imagine. The best I could do was here are NASA astronauts, Mark and Scott Kelly, who are identical twins, and they both decided to become an astronaut. So I guess they make pretty similar decisions in life. Though even there, you can see they made somewhat different decisions. One of them has a mustache, the other one does not. Or what if you knew you had been in the same situation before, but there's no way you would ever remember what you did before? Best I could do here is this by now pretty old movie that probably dates me, but there's this movie called 50 First Dates where Drew Barrymore plays a character that every morning forgets everything that happened to her the previous day. So the point here is that I have to think about pretty extreme scenarios to illustrate this in human contexts. And consequently, scenarios like this have mostly been studied in the philosophy literature to the extent that they have. But for AI, all these questions could make a lot of sense, right? One AI system could easily be facing a copy of itself, or at least another system that's using the same code to make decisions or something like that. Okay, let's look at some of these examples. So this idea of your code being legible to another player allows us to another way to get to cooperation in the prisoner's dilemma. And this is the concept of program equilibrium. So now we're going to play the prisoner's dilemma just once, except we're going to play it in a slightly different way. We have two programmers that each choose a program, and the program will play on the programmer's behalf. How does that make things any different? Well, the key thing here is that the programs can read each other. And now here's an interesting trick. So if you say, well, here's a program. This program says, check if the other agent's code is exactly the same as my code. If so, cooperate, otherwise defect. Now, if they both play exactly that program, what will happen is they will cooperate. And moreover, that is actually an equilibrium of this larger program game, right? Like if I'm the red programmer and I'm wondering, we're supposed to play this, but should I deviate? Assuming that the other player, the blue player, is in fact going to use this program. Well, no, I shouldn't. I shouldn't make any other program, because if I code up a different program, in fact, whatever different program I use is going to get the other player to defect instead. And so maybe I defect or I cooperate, but in any case, the outcome will be worse for me. So here we've actually made cooperation and equilibrium by extending the game to this larger program space, by making the programs legible to each other. It's a nice basic idea. I think there's a lot of work to be done on it. In particular, this all, again, seems very brittle. Like if for some reason I put an extra space in my program, technically they wouldn't be the same program, and we would start to defect on each other. That seems kind of silly. How do we make this more robust? Oh, I see there's a question in the chat. Yes, please go ahead.
Hey, thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. So I've been wondering a little bit about this context where you can read the other player's code and its connection to the kind of epistemic game theory foundations of people like Stallnacher, where you try to recover solution concepts by having kind of explicit models of common rationality. And that seems like a case where you're kind of assuming that the agents have probability 1 on the kind of decision relevant aspects of the other agent's epistemic states. And so I'm wondering, in what sense is this the same? And like, in what sense is kind of epistemic game theory already assuming you have access to the kind of like behavior code of the other agents? And that's kind of normally how I think of as like the best grounding for solution concepts. And in what way is it different from this?
Yeah, good question. I don't know exactly how to tie them together. I mean, many concepts in epistemic game theory will actually lead to defection in this case, right? Of course. So, so much work in epistemic game theory manages to actually show that dominated strategies should not be played, which would exactly get to defection here. So I think, getting kind of to the epistemic foundations of this kind of thinking is important. So to what extent it's already out there, I haven't really seen like a convincing argument that it is already out there in some sense. There's lots of kind of closely related concepts. So in just a little bit, I'll also talk about, knowing that you play against a copy of yourself, but not explicitly in terms of reading its code and what you should do there. So maybe we should postpone it to that.
I just had one idea, which is that the epistemic game theory stuff usually assumes causal decision theory, so they're going to end up defecting. But maybe if they assumed evidential decision theory, they wouldn't. I'm not sure though.
Let's try to get to those slides.
Okay. Thank you.
So very briefly, just so we can, in fact, move on to those slides. So there's lots of work, I think, to be done here in making this more robust. My student, Casper Oesterheld, has a nice paper on trying to make this more robust by doing something like an instantaneous version of tit for tat, if you happen to know what the tit for tat strategy is. And basically the idea is, well, just look at the last line here. So one idea is that you could simulate what the other program does against this program and then do that. So like, I'm going to do to you whatever you do against me. Now, the one issue with that is that you know, if the other player does the same thing, then they will just keep calling each other. The recursion will never bottom out. And so one way to fix that is to say, well, with some small probability, we'll just cooperate. And that way you would also get to cooperation. And this is less brittle in some, like here I can add spaces or change various other things. But still has its limitations. Like if you wanted to do this with 3 players, that doesn't work quite as well anymore. We've also done some work, again, I'll go through this rather quickly, but we've done some work on, instead of really specifying a program, imagine that all you can do is specify utilities to your agents, right? That, you know, you could say you should play according to these utilities. And maybe also you can do that in a kind of conditional way that you should play according to these utilities, but only if the other player agrees to play according to similar utilities. And so those utilities may not be your own ones or may not be the real ones, but if you set this up in the right way, that way you can guarantee yourself, if the agents are good game theorists in some sense, you can set up these payoffs in such a way that in some cases, you will guarantee that they will reach better outcomes with the modified utilities that you've committed to. Also, I'll briefly revisit this idea of disarmament, right? So I talked about removing mixed or randomized strategies. What does that even mean? So now it's going to be somewhat similar to the program equilibrium context, except here the programs won't be able to read each other, but the programmers will act sequentially and alternatingly. They'll add lines to their program. What do I mean by that? So here's how the process is supposed to go. The red programmer first is supposed to add a line. The first line of the red program is going to be with probability 40%, just cooperate. And that does not mean with probability 60% defect. It means with probability 40% cooperate and otherwise move to the next line of the program, which hasn't been written yet. But at that point, the blue programmer is supposed to commit his line, which is the same line. And once that line has been committed to the program, now it's the red programmer's turn again to add the same line again, but this is an independent coin toss, right? So actually at this point, the probability of not cooperating or of going further into the code is down to 36%. And they keep doing this, and as they add more and more lines like this, the probability that we won't cooperate shrinks down all the way to 0. And the key thing here, and why it's a kind of disarmament, right? You're kind of throwing away part of your ability to defect. And again, the key thing here is that the whole process itself is in equilibrium, right? So you could at some point deviate as one of the programmers, right? So the blue programmer could say, well, you know what? I'm not going to add the line, sorry, I'm just going to defect. The blue programmer could do that, but in that case, the red programmer won't add the next line and will also defect with the remaining probability. And the numbers are chosen such that that would actually be worse for the blue programmer, so that everybody has an incentive to stick with this disarmament protocol and eventually start to cooperate. And the nice thing here is that you can actually prove that this in some sense always works. There's a folk theorem that no matter the game, in some sense, you can always achieve cooperation in this way. All right, so now let's get back to the question. So for those of you who haven't seen this before, or even the ones that have, so far we've assumed that, we had a red agent and a blue agent. What if we had 2 red agents? Okay, so imagine playing Prisoner's Dilemma against your twin. Let's say your identical twin, but much more than a regular identical twin in the human world. This is someone that you always agree with. You always make the same decisions as your identical twin in this case, right? So you've always grown up together. And anytime anybody asked you to make a choice, right? Somebody asked you what flavor ice cream would you like? You both said chocolate. And the next week you both said strawberry, right? Every single time you chose the same thing. And now somehow, one day you're supposed to play Prisoner's Dilemma against each other. And you're still selfish, right? So you still care about your own payoff and not your twin. And also let's assume that you will never interact again. Somehow this story got kind of dark, but let's assume that that's the situation. How should you play? What would you do? Would you cooperate or would you defect? So I see there's another question in the chat, but let me get back to that later. So actually, let's do this with the benefit of Zoom. Let's do it by show of hands or like thumbs up or something. So in the situation where you play against your identical twin that always takes the same decision as you, would you cooperate or would you defect? Who among you would, by show of hands, would cooperate? All right. I don't know if we can quickly get a count, but I see a fair number of hands go up. Or thumbs also do. All right, so hands and thumbs down, please. And so now, how many among you would defect? So raise your hand or thumb if you would defect. At this point, I see no hands going up. So that's interesting, right? Because this really flies in the face of the reasoning that we did before that said, well, no matter what the other agent does, I'm better off defecting. A slight variant, this will be fun. So now imagine that you almost always agree with your twin, but not always. So just to make it concrete, one time when you were 8 years old, somebody asked you what flavor ice cream you wanted. One of you said strawberry, the other one said chocolate. Everybody was in shock. This had never happened before. And somehow it never happened again, but you all remembered. Okay. Everything else is the same. Okay. So again, show of hands, who would cooperate? All right. A number of hands, though maybe a little bit more cautious than last time. Who would defect? So hands down if you said cooperate. Who would defect? We have no hands up. This, by the way, this kind of response makes traditional game theorists very uncomfortable. But there seems to be something to it as well, right? Because presumably the reasoning here is that, well, if I cooperate, chances are my twinner is going to cooperate as well. And that's a better outcome than both of us defecting, which, you know, chances are that's what's going to happen if I defect. Okay. And of course, our reason for being interested in this is not so much these imagined scenarios of, you know, very similar human beings as it is AI agents that maybe use the same or some of the same code. I'm sorry, one of the question askers is already, yeah, so if you have to leave, or in any case, if you want to ask me a question later, please feel free to send it by email. I'm happy to respond there. Okay, are we maybe running out of time a little bit? So let me try to finish up. Good. So I'm going to skip over a few things here. So some other examples, but just to get back to the earlier comment, right, that this actually comes down to a debate between evidential decision theory and causal decision theory, if you've ever heard of those things. If you haven't, so these are two variants of decision theory that in normal circumstances will generally give you the same decision or recommend the same decision. But in these kind of situations that are on the slide, in particular, we only talked about the second one, they give different recommendations because the difference comes out in settings where what decision you make tells you something about the rest of the world that you care about, but that isn't caused by your decision, right? So the fact that you cooperate is evidence that your twin is also going to cooperate, but it doesn't seem like you're causing your twin to cooperate. And so causal decision theory, let's start with that one at the bottom of the slide, says that you shouldn't take those kinds of correlations into account. You should make your decision based on what your decision is causally affecting. Whereas evidential decision theory does take those correlations into account. It says when you consider an option, think about conditional on you playing that option, how happy do you expect to be? And that's kind of how you say how good that option is, and you're going to play the one that seems best from that perspective. And so those give different recommendations in our twin prisoner's dilemma game. All right, so I think I should probably just about wrap up. We have some more, we have a philosophical paper arguing against causal decision.
We want a bit of flexibility. You don't have to super rush, but I'll leave the judgment to you, but don't worry too much about it.
Okay, then in that case, I'll throw in one more, I'll skip over this. I want to throw in one more thing, which is imperfect recall. So this was the last example I had of how AI agents might be different from us. And one way in which they can be different from us is that they could deliberately forget, right? I forget stuff all the time, but it's not very systematic. But in an AI system, we could deliberately make forget, for example, for privacy reasons. And this gets into some weird examples. I'm curious, just by show of hands, how many people have heard of the Sleeping Beauty problem before? Okay, we have a couple. 3. Okay, so let me give the problem for everybody else, and then we'll see how everybody thinks about it. So here's a story problem, and it sounds kind of like maybe the Monty Hall problem, if you're familiar with that, but it's not quite the same kind of thing. In some ways, this is a more philosophical puzzle, but it certainly sounds like a pure probability puzzle. So here's the story. We imagine there is a study being conducted on a university campus somewhere. Let's assume everything is conducted responsibly and carefully, and the study's been approved and so on. So here are the rules of the study. There's a participant in the study who is going to come in on Sunday, and we're going to call her Sleeping Beauty, okay, for reasons that will become very clear. And Sleeping Beauty, again, on Sunday comes in, and she learns all the rules of the experiment, and she will never forget those. And she agrees to participate in the experiment. And here are the rules of the experiment. On Sunday, after she agrees, the experimenter is going to give her a cocktail of drugs that will make her fall asleep. And then after she falls asleep, he is going to toss a coin, which we all know is a fair coin, 50-50. That lands either heads or tails, and that's going to determine what the experimenter does next. If the coin lands heads, what he is going to do is he's going to wake her up for a little while on Monday with a different cocktail of drugs. She'll be awake for about 5 minutes, and then he's going to make her sleep again. And he's going to keep her sleeping all of Tuesday. On the other hand, if the coin lands tails, then he is also going to wake her up on Monday, then make her sleep again. But in this case, he's also going to wake her up on Tuesday with the same cocktail of drugs. Okay, so this is a picture of when she wakes up. Now, the key thing here is that it's well known, including to Beauty, that these drugs mess with the ability to form new memories. So even though she will remember the rules of the experiment, which she learned beforehand throughout, when she wakes up in one of these scenarios, she won't remember anything that happened before. And in particular, if she's woken up on Tuesday, because the coin landed tails, she won't remember that she woke up before. She won't feel like a lot of time has passed. And so to her, it's indistinguishable being woken up on Tuesday from being woken up on Monday. And of course, she also doesn't see the coin. Okay, so she doesn't know what day it is, and she doesn't know how the coin landed. Fine. So what is the problem? Again, nobody does this experiment for real, as far as I know. But the problem is, imagine you are Sleeping Beauty and you've just been awoken. So you know, well, you know you're in one of these situations that It could be Monday, it could be Tuesday. The coin could have landed heads. It could have landed tails. Presumably, you're not sure. But the question is, what is your subjective probability? Philosophers like to call it credence, your degree of belief as a probability that the coin landed heads. So have you now learned something about how the coin landed? Might be one way. And you know, what precisely is the probability? Okay, I always like to let people think about this one just for a little bit before, like I won't really give it away because there's still disagreement about the answer here. But anybody, maybe especially the people who haven't seen it before, do you have an immediate response? What might be an argument for one sensible number or another? And don't worry too much about getting it right, because again, it's not, you know, in the literature, actually, it's not clear yet what the right answer to this problem is. So probably whatever number you pick, you'll be in good company. Anybody want to come up with an argument for what your subjective probability should be after just finding out that you woke up and knowing the rules, right? And everything here is trustworthy and well conducted. So you know nobody is messing around with you. These are the rules. You know the effect of the drug and all that. Any takers? Or anybody want to throw out a number? Okay, there's something in the chat. 1/2. Okay, I don't know if it's somebody who already has seen it before. I don't know, Daniel, I don't know if you're able to speak or if you want to make an argument for it. If not, that's also fine.
I had seen this before. I mean, I also don't know what I actually think. I just, no one was responding. I wanted to give some grist for the mill. I'm kind of like looking forward. It feels like from the beginning, you kind of, if you know that you would like shift to 2/3 if you wake up, then you kind of already know you should shift because you know you're going to have one of the experiences. And so it's weird that you think this coin is unbiased, but that if you kind of satisfy reflection, like if you think you're going to update to something for sure, you should already be there. It's weird that you should be 2/3 that the coin comes up tails, given that you're now given that you think the coin is fair. And so this kind of like, you haven't really learned anything. If you're going to satisfy reflection, you should be 1/2.
Right. And Daniel is already contrasting it with the other common answer, which Nora meanwhile has given in the chat. But just to review Daniel's, and this is really the standard argument for the 1/2 position. You say, look, you know, on Sunday, clearly you should believe that there's a 1/2 chance that the coin will land heads, right? Everybody knows it's a fair coin. So on Sunday, you have no reason to think it's not 1/2. And then at some point you wake up. Well, you always knew you were going to be woken up, right? And as kind of good Bayesians, maybe if you find out something that you already knew was true or was going to be true, you don't update your beliefs, right? There's no reason, like you haven't learned anything new. Yeah, you woke up, but you always knew you're going to be woken up. So there's no reason to update your beliefs. So it should still be 50-50. Okay, that's the one common answer. So Nora, meanwhile, in the chat said 2/3 for tails. So that would be 1/3 for heads, right? So that's typically considered the 1/3 answer. Nora, do you want to provide any arguments?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's sort of 3 possible states I can end up in when I wake up, either on Monday and heads and on Monday, or tails and on Monday, or tails and on Tuesday. So if I wake up and I'm like, this I'm 2/3 likely it's in a tail scenario and 1/3 likely it's in a head scenario.
Exactly, right? So if you assign uniform probability over all the 3 outcomes here, or all the 3 experiences here on the right, then you would in fact have the answer of 1/3. Tomasz also has.
Yeah, another position, I mean, it's maybe similar to what Daniel was talking about, but if you were woken up and you could take a bet about what the result of the coin was, would you bet 1/2 or 1 to 2 or 1/3?
Great. Okay, that's so this is really nicely leading into more slides that I have. I want to be a little bit cognizant of time, but if we have time, we can go into that. Good. Okay, so Sorry, yes, Nora, go ahead.
So one thing we could do is maybe now or once you wrap up, like take a first round of questions, and then if you have some more time, you might want to go back to slides again, so we get a bit of a sense for how many questions there are. That would be my option.
Good. Okay, so I'll do sort of like intermediate summary here, right? So we've seen 2 answers, 1/3 and 1/2. Those are the 2 common answers. By the way, this is a lot of fun if you're ever at some sort of academic style cocktail party and you want to get some discussion going, give this problem. I'll almost guarantee you, if you have a table of 5 people, you'll have some people that really will argue forcefully for 1/3, and some people will argue forcefully for a half. And so, there goes your evening. Interestingly, this is actually very closely tied to what decision theory you should adopt. So there is a sense in which choosing the 1/3 answer lines up more with causal decision theory, and choosing the 1/2 answer lines up more with evidential decision theory, though there are some subtle details to that as well. But it's kind of a surprising idea, right? That the way we form beliefs in these kind of contexts actually is very closely related to the way we make decisions, or should be. That still doesn't really tell you what the right answer is in some sense. So that in some sense says, like, as long as you adopt the correct combination of theories, you're going to make good decisions. So is there a true answer to the Sleeping Beauty puzzle? I think at some level that really is a philosophical question. So just to give away where I'm actually more inclined to the 1/3 answer myself. But then in some sense, I have to argue what is wrong with the 1/2 argument that we just talked about, right? Like, so I have to somehow argue that you do learn something upon waking up. But what do you learn upon waking up? Because you already knew you were going to be awoken. So it depends a little bit on how you interpret what you're conditioning on. Really what you learned is, I just woke up. I just woke up. And I want to argue that that's different from, for example, learning that at some point in time I wake up. Right? If that's how you interpret it, then certainly the half argument is right. But I would argue that I just woke up is a different bit of information. And because what you're conditioning on is what philosophers call a centered world, right? So a centered experience. Sorry, it's a centered experience. So you have a certain experience, right? Like, just like I have a certain experience looking at my screen right now. And that is something about what we're given, right? And at some level, we don't really know how those experiences are sampled. And that's, in some sense, a little bit of the missing bit of information in this problem that would allow you to get to a concrete conclusion. So I have some more work on that. But so, for the purpose of today, let's finish up. Let me see if I can do this right. Let me quickly summarize. So here is what we saw so far, that even if we have almost perfectly aligned agents, we can still get these game theoretic failures to cooperate. Then we talked about ways of getting to cooperation. Some of them make sense for human beings as well, and others don't seem to really make a lot of sense for human beings, but seem natural for AI systems or advanced AI systems. And again, my approach tends to be, let's not limit ourselves to just one approach. Whatever we can get to help us is a good thing. So many questions here that many of which we want to investigate in our new lab. The goal of the lab really is to find the foundations of game theory for highly advanced AI. And then we've seen a number of these questions come by already. How should you play with other agents whose code is overlapping with yours? Does it matter if that code is visible? What if you know that you might be being simulated? Should that affect your actions? And again, more generally, what design decisions on the agents can improve how they cooperate? Are they realistic? Are they robust? And in particular, also will be very interested in learning. Right, so of course in AI there's lots of work on learning. Can we design learning algorithms that converge to good equilibria, and in what kind of context can we do that? All right, so let me end there. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for taking a little bit long, but I'm happy to stick around and answer more questions.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Let's move on to some questions. I can maybe start us off with a first one initially and give you guys some time to think. And then it will be your turn next. So one thing I'm curious about, so you have been talking about maybe sort of opening our perspective a bit to designing AIs in ways different to how humans usually function, and that might give us more space to like find cooperative and robust dynamics, etc. I'm curious whether you have thoughts on whether there might be like concerns sort of pushing in the other direction, where like, well, maybe this makes it like harder for us to understand AI systems, or to like for us to interact with them, and yeah, whether like we should be concerned about some things there that might push us towards wanting to like design systems that are more like us because it makes them more understandable, or better for us to cooperate with. I'm not sure what the considerations there are.
Yeah, that's a good question. So usually understandability is a desirable thing, but of course, as you point out, right, it's like you might get cooperative behavior from something you don't understand, or you might get uncooperative behavior from something you do understand. So those things generally could come apart. And right, so to the extent they're like humans, we would like them to be like the better versions of ourselves and not the worst versions of ourselves. So that's one thing to potentially be concerned about. So would it be a problem, right? I think this is maybe the best way to interpret the question. If we had these systems that, well, there's two versions of the question. One is like, what if we have these systems that are very cooperative, but we don't really understand what they're doing? Is that a problem? So we have a well-running world and things are great, except we don't really understand what is keeping things so cooperative. At some level, I would still like to know, but maybe that's not the worst kind of outcome, right? A bigger worry might be that, well, we don't really understand exactly how these systems would work. And so actually things might somehow backfire on us, right? That even though, we tried to design them in some sort of way that we thought they would be more likely to cooperate, but because of our lack of understanding, we actually missed some aspect of this, and things actually turn out horrible. So that is something that we should worry about, and hopefully we can think our way through this well enough that we actually would be confident that the systems would work better. Right, and so I think some degree of caution is in order to say that, well, we really want to, at some level, understand the foundations of what we're doing, and we probably have better intuitions about that to the extent that the systems resemble human beings. Though again, that's not totally guaranteed either, right? To the extent that they're in some ways or in many ways more powerful than we are, even if they resemble us in other ways, their behavior might start to be very different. So yeah, I don't have a very easy answer to that. I do agree that understandability generally is a good thing, and human likeness generally helps us to understand things better. But I wouldn't say that's completely universal either. And so sometimes we might, right, and some things might be made simpler, in fact, by changing the setup, even if the system is less like us. Maybe it's actually easier to think about if we design it differently. No sort of very clear answer to that, but at the very least, I think we should explore the possibility and try to figure out what we can do with it, and then go from there.
Cool. Yeah, I'm happy, Vincent, if you just want to take the hands, this might be easiest. But I guess like Daniel might want to ask a question.
Thanks so much. I'm definitely going to check out the your lab online. It sounds really cool. So I was thinking more about the kind of one of the initial kind of framings, the question you have, which is like there's a bunch of different agents interacting that we've built, and then you can get these kind of game theoretic tragedies. And some of your solutions are, like changing the code in certain ways, or exploring different decision theories or stuff like that. And I was curious in your thinking and thinking of your lab, how much kind of like evolutionary models come into this. So if you think of like proportions of types in a population, you have like cases where cooperators, like simple cooperators, just like go to extinction when there are defectors in the population. And usually some mechanism for saving cooperation is some kind of correlated interaction. And I was wondering how much this kind of like Lobian code reading stuff is like a way of kind of getting correlated interaction. Like it's not like maybe like not direct mapping because you're still playing, but you kind of get to only see the kinds of behavior in a correlated way. Yeah, and I was wondering how much this kind of worry about, if you imagine different actors changing the codes of their systems they're selling, and if they can get like a competitive advantage by defecting, if like the conditions under which this would drive the market kind of agents to these bad outcomes. So it was a bunch of stuff, but I was really interested in.
Exactly, good and multifaceted question. So let me try to take it in parts. So first of all, yeah, just the role of evolution. So game theorists often, so there's evolutionary game theory as well, which sounds like you're already aware of, in which we think of agents, that play certain fixed strategies, growing or shrinking in the population in proportion to how well they're doing relative to the rest of the population, and that, under certain conditions will converge to equilibrium. Game theorists often consider this kind of part of learning in games, and it's some dynamic process that will get us to equilibrium. So I'm kind of thinking of that in the context of this bullet. Yeah, so I have various thoughts about this and how you could get to more desirable equilibria in this context as well. So we have some kind of preliminary thoughts about how to design different environments and kind of safe spaces for the more cooperative agents, so that they can grow in numbers, as opposed to not being able to get any foothold in a population of defecting agents. So generally speaking, yes, we'll be interested in evolutionary game theory models and how to set things up to favor cooperation in those kind of models. Right? In evolutionary game theory, also generally in learning in games, how do you design these algorithms to tend to converge to good equilibrium? Because many of the traditional results, if they give any guarantee at all, it's usually that they converge to an equilibrium, but there's not much said about which equilibrium it is. So sometimes you can converge to better equilibria. And then I think there also, and this may be more the second part of your question, you may be able to enrich the equilibrium space by enriching the game space in some sense, by allowing certain kinds of correlation, by allowing repeated interaction, maybe getting them to read each other and have that affect how things evolve. So as you said, this is a very rich space of options to try to think through, which I think is definitely worthwhile. So probably in our lab, we'll focus first on just, at least let's try to converge to good equilibria as opposed to bad ones. What can we do there? Because even there's surprisingly little work. And then I think it's nice to kind of enrich that, because in some games, like the Prisoner's Dilemma, one-stage Prisoner's Dilemma at least, well, there is only one equilibrium, so that doesn't really help you very much. But then you can maybe combine that with some of the other techniques that we've seen to enrich the equilibrium space. And then you could combine these techniques that, like, how do you evolve something like the good program equilibria that we saw, right? Instead of saying, well, it exists and hopefully we'll just decide to code that up. You might say, well, maybe we're in a much richer space, and there is this wonderful program equilibrium out there, but we're not smart enough to think about it. And instead, these systems will update dynamically. How do you set things up in such a way that you would think that they would converge to the good program equilibrium? I think we're several steps away from being able to think about that well. But that's a really nice direction, I think. Tomasz, I think, was next.
Thanks for the interesting talk. I'm interested in what is your favorite model, or what models of bounded rationality and agents you're thinking about? Or like, I'm not sure how relevant it is, and like in the current state of game theory for agents, especially for strong agents or agents of different strengths or different rationality, different speeds, different any kind of limitations. But also when you mentioned that like all the reasons around why people may not be the best type of agents to emulate it, to me it seems like a lot of why people are particular types of game playing agents is because they are similarly bounded somehow, and they have theory of each other's minds, which is, I mean, probably not very accurate, but it seems like it's at least feels like it's a decent approximation. I didn't really know the research behind this, which probably exists. So I'm curious, like, what is if you have any like interesting models in mind or directions of research.
Yeah, good. There are some results like this in the game theory literature of how bounded agents would actually get the better equilibrium, like maybe if they're bounded in memory or something like that, you can prove that you would only have better equilibria. There are a few models like that. Of course, in some extreme sense, maybe you could say, well, if nobody is smart enough to even consider deviating from the proposed action, then we can have really good equilibria. So I think on the one hand, there is value to that. On the other hand, we may not be able to really effectively constrain the intelligence of the systems, other than maybe not build them. I think part of your question was maybe also about the relative strengths of the agents in terms of reasoning. And does that, like, does it help, for example, to have kind of balanced strength of reasoning or not? I don't have a general answer to that. I would say probably not in general, right? Like, I think I mentioned before, like, the game theorists not playing the equilibrium of the traveler's dilemma, right? And that's something that actually would, so it's kind of a funny thing, but also, like, even if you were a really extreme game theorist, you might, or you generally would be much more likely to choose a high number in the traveler's dilemma, right? That game with the two qualities against an agent that maybe wasn't doing so many levels of reasoning, right? Because in that game, remember, right, like it's about the lower of the two qualities. That's the main thing. And so if you think that the other agent is at least somewhat likely to choose a high quality, maybe because they're not reasoning through too many levels of the game, then that actually gives you a much larger incentive to also pick a high number, right? If the other agent picks a high number and you don't, you're really going to regret your action. So I guess all that shows is that the levels of reasoning don't necessarily need to be balanced in order for this to potentially help give a better outcome. I do think, by the way, there's something to, like, if you really, reason through something like the traveler's dilemma, you will kind of find this, that like, we're doing so many levels of it. Like, if there's only one small chance that somebody doesn't go through all these levels of reasoning, I'd be much happier picking a higher number. So I probably should just pick a higher number. To some extent, that's kind of like cutting short the reasoning, but also at some level it really makes sense. There are actually formal models that you can give where so you can give a Bayesian game where there's a small, even a very, very small proportion of agents that just choose the highest outcome. And that completely changes the equilibrium to everybody, including the highly rational agents, picking very high numbers. Because the fact that those few always high picking agents are there then changes in some sense what everybody is doing. And because everybody else is changing, you're like that, you get into this kind of virtuous cycle that makes things better. So just to summarize, I guess, right? Like, so the reasoning strengths of different systems do definitely play a role, and sometimes weaker reasoning avoids some tragedies. Of course, it can also, in some cases, lead to some tragedies. Generally, having worked in game theory for a while, my initial suspicion would be that you can probably show examples going just about every way, that like sometimes imbalance helps, sometimes imbalance hurts. And yeah, sometimes more rationality helps and sometimes it hurts. So that's not a very, that's not a particularly delightful answer in some sense, but I think that's probably how it's going to play out, would be my suspicion.
Thanks. So I don't want to have one more concrete question. Or I mean, by the way, the example you showed is the same as the beauty pageant, right? And K-level rationality in the beauty pageant game.
The beauty pageant. What
beauty pageant. Sorry, sorry. This is relevant. I was thinking about a different game which has its same mechanic as, or same dynamic as the Travelers game. But my question would be, well, do you have any what are the models that the people can use or for limiting the rationality of agents? Because I mean, I know several models. There is this information theoretical boundary rationality from Brown. You can have K-level rationality in game theory, but these all have the sort of the downside. For example, they don't really limit computation, and people in also Bayesian decision theory are struggling with how do we limit agents in terms of computation. And I'm just wondering, like, if you have any intuitions about where do we go there if we want to limit rationality in this sense, not in the sense of like limited information or randomness.
Yes, good. So that's good. So, and there's sort of two questions there that are related, right? One is what are kind of good, robust models of limited rationality, right? Like level K reasoning or something is like a very specific assumption on how the agent reasons, which actually matches what human beings do to some extent, right? So that's nice, but it doesn't seem like kind of a very general model that would capture lots of reasoning agents, and you just have to kind of get lucky that that's how your agent behaves. So there's one kind of question about modeling. Is there some kind of robust model out there? And another question is, to the extent that we deliberately design some weaknesses into the system, how should you do that, right? So I think those are somewhat different though related questions. So that neither one of them do I have very good answers for. I think for the first one, sometimes people think about computational complexity, right? And like, if we assume certain problems are computationally hard, like factoring large numbers. Well, maybe with quantum computation it's not, right? But some problem like this, that is pretty robust, that sort of no matter how smart an agent gets, they're still going to run into fundamental limitations there. And so one question might be, is there sort of a good way to take advantage of that, right? That somehow, let's say we're pretty convinced that factoring large numbers is hard, to somehow build that into the games in such a way that we reach better outcomes as long as the agents cannot suddenly quickly factor very large numbers, right? That would, so like as long as you're confident that that's true, then that's in some sense a very robust way of doing things. I don't know if that was really getting at your question very, very much, but
it was. Thanks. That was. I mean, this is another more like assuming cryptographic primitives are secure. Yeah, like that's. I was mostly looking for like what do you think is sort of promising for future research. So this does answer my question. Thanks.
I think Nora was next.
Maybe TJ should go first. I have asked already. I'll happily ask afterwards.
Okay, so TJ.
Yeah, so I think like my question is slightly tangential and orthogonal to this, but related to program equilibrium. So I think like when I think about program equilibrium, it seems to me that there's something about decision theories of two agents which are entangled with each other, which are interdependent with each other. So like one of the source code says that like, if the other algorithm is equal to me, then like I want to do this, otherwise I want to do something else, etc., etc. I was curious to think about what would be the implications of talking about preferences which are interdependent. So like, let's forget about like the decision-making procedure for the moment, but just about what I want as an agent, what my preferences are. Let's say I have like something like, oh, if Vincent likes strawberry ice cream, then I would like I don't know, a banana milkshake or something. Like I could have like arbitrary dependencies on other people, and maybe like so in utilitarian model philosophy, like this comes up as the idea of other regarding preferences, which can lead to double counting if you have two utilitarians, and therefore you want to screen off the other regarding preferences, the part that depends on others. But I'm curious to think about, what if one could study the structure of this interdependency, and maybe in the same way that programming equilibrium is trying to say, if two agents of these designs compete, what is the equilibrium point? One could ask a similar aggregation or social choice aggregation question, that if preferences themselves are actually interdependent in these ways, what is the fixed point aggregate? Like, the way to do aggregation is not necessarily by doing preferences over some external discrete rankings, but like maybe like they contain more complex interdependencies, and we can still compute the aggregation by using this sort of fixed point operator or something.
That's interesting. So just to kind of, recap, first of all, right? So there are kind of these somewhat simple models of other regarding preferences where I say like, well, my utility is really my value, right? So distinguish value and like utility is what I finally care about, but like initially I care about value, but I care also like 0.9 times Nora's value. And so when we have these kind of other regarding preferences, do we get to better outcomes? And there are some models that say, there are some papers that show that under certain conditions that does really help. But there are these kind of concerns about, if you don't do it right, you get some weird double counting and the like. So now most of your question I took to be maybe a little bit more of a question about design as well, right? Like just as in program equilibrium, we talked about learning a little bit, but mostly there you would think about constructing your program in a clever way so that you get cooperation, right? And so maybe a related question would be that if we can make preferences interdependent in that way, is there a good way to make them interdependent that in some sense guarantees good outcomes over a large variety of situations? Is that a reasonable way to interpret your question or part of it?
So I think like there's like two separate parts of the question. I think one is the more artificial system part, which is like, can we design preferences in a way where we are not thinking about preferences purely in ranking, like as a ranking object, but maybe like preferences themselves have like these sort of like logical dependencies, and how can we design these for better cooperation, better beneficial things to happen? I think there's also another question, which is something like there are a bunch of like debates in social choice theory around why like aggregation turns out to be hard. And like maybe the question is something more generally like, could this sort of like way of thinking about preferences as things that in themselves have logical dependencies, and therefore what you're computing is not this aggregation function, but something that is like finding the equilibrium point, the fixed point of those like interdependent preference objects or something. Is that the way to think about social choice itself? Is I think the other
question. Yeah, so maybe at some level, I guess, like, the social choice impossibility results are what they are, right? And if you really have agents that only purely care about the outcome directly and don't have any kind of other regarding preferences and the like, I'm not really sure how you get around the impossibility results in social choice. But maybe there are settings where you can argue, or maybe by design, we can kind of enrich that preference space a little bit. And then maybe in some sense you can maybe get around the kind of traditional impossibility results, right? If we now, so in order to get around those results, it's, I guess, important that the traditional model of just caring directly about the alternatives isn't somehow a special case or a limiting case, right? It has to somehow be, bounded away from that to actually have a different style of preference or different kind of thing to care about. But if so, then yeah, maybe there are some reasonable possibilities there. I don't know. It's an interesting question. Like, is there, so one kind of concrete question I could imagine from that would be if preferences were sort of sufficiently interdependent in the right way, or interdependent here. Interdependent means something specific, but interrelated, let's just say. Then, are you kind of bounded away from the bad outcomes or the bad properties that you get in the traditional social choice impossibility results? That's an interesting question, right? So like, and I do, so there are some results out there on, I don't know if you ever saw this price of anarchy literature, where you look at how bad equilibria might be compared to the best outcome. And there, I do know of at least one paper there that considers altruism, right? So really caring about others' valuations, and how much better does that make issues regarding the price of anarchy? How much better do the equilibria get? In some sense, how far away do you get from the negative results? And so you could think of that as maybe a special case of a more general agenda of how to design preferences so that you kind of quickly get away from the impossibility, right? Or quickly get away from the bad property of the impossibility result. Yeah, so I hope that kind of got at your question.
Yeah, sort of, thanks. I think like I'll just add like, I think this also opens up like the interesting question of like, what does it mean to do mechanism design in the space of like program equilibria? And yeah, like maybe it's not immediately clear to me what is the space that occupies.
Yeah, that's good. Usually mechanism design is interpreted as there's some external agent or entity that's choosing, that has a certain amount of control and gets to choose rules. But that's not necessarily the only way to interpret it, right? In principle, agents could agree on a mechanism without there being an explicit separate entity. And like somewhat related is the role of mediators in game theory, right? Like you could kind of create your own mediator, and maybe with some cryptographic techniques as well. And so once you go in that direction, maybe at some level it becomes more about designing the agents themselves, right? As you design them themselves, you can, in some sense, maybe integrate the mechanism design problem in there as well. So sometimes it makes sense to reason from this external perspective, like, okay, well, we're this one entity that gets to pick some of the rules, and how should we pick it? But in some ways, maybe you can also integrate that into the agents.
Yeah, this is actually like a little bit related to what I was wanting to ask about. So when you shared your description for the talk, you also shared a paper called Designing Preferences, Beliefs, and Identities for Artificial Intelligence. And I was just sort of interested for you to maybe specifically for identities, but also happy for other things, like sort of the question of like, what are the relevance boundaries to draw around agents, and how does that influence coordination dynamics? Can you say some words about sort of where you're thinking there is maybe, and does that provide levers to shaping games, dynamics, etc.?
Yeah, great. So somewhere in this deck of slides, I have some more slides on that, but I'm not going to try to find them because it probably will take too long. There is, you can see, I didn't really talk about it, but there is part of this talk that went into that, right? So sorry, well, that I didn't talk about, but so yes, so that paper and also some other work that we've done thinks about kind of deliberate design of boundaries of agents. And so how do you use that to get to cooperation is another interesting question, right? So in principle, also like the boundaries of the agents don't need to be necessarily that well defined, or at least you could say, well, there's one boundary for the preferences and a different boundary for the beliefs of the system, right? So like the system, shares information across all these nodes, but this part has these preferences and this part has these other preferences. Or the other way around, that we're actually going to not share information across all the nodes, but they all pursue the same goal. So you can play with those boundaries. And so what will get you to better outcomes? Well, one thing you might say is like, I'm just going to try to make everything one huge agent pursuing a single goal. And then at some level, we won't get these kind of tragedies happening. Maybe you lose some benefits of things not being entirely centralized and being more flexible. And maybe there's questions of like, what if one day you do encounter a different system? How does it interact with that? But there are interesting questions. So like, a little bit more concretely, we do have this paper that we frame in terms of role assignment. So this is so a little bit more accessible version of the story is, and like I'm a professor, so we, I think in terms of faculty life, right? So sometimes we're assigned to committees, right? There's all kinds of committees that faculty need to be on, graduate admissions, faculty search, the graduate program, the undergraduate, you name it. And often those committees, maybe one of the people is the chair on the committee and the others are the members of the committee. But there are all kinds of dynamics that happen in that, right? Like maybe the chair of the committee really wants the members of the committee to do some of the work so that the chair doesn't have to do it all herself. But maybe the members don't feel quite so incentivized. And so sometimes you can think about how you would assign roles in a way that you get better equilibria. For example, if you have two faculty members, A and B, and you have two committees to assign them to, if you make A the chair on both committees, then maybe B doesn't really have a whole lot of incentive to help A. But if you make A the chair on one and B the chair on the other, then you create this kind of interdependence where they say, look, hey, B, if you're not going to help me on my committee, I'm not going to help you on your committee either. And so then B says, oh, okay, well, I'll help you, don't worry. And so that way we actually get the cooperation by making them depend on each other, right? So that is, now here the story is about agents that pre-exist, like the professors that get assigned and assigning them to roles. But it's maybe not so far away from this idea of designing the boundaries of the system, right? You could think in some sense like the chair of a committee is itself kind of an agent, right? So that there is, you can get somewhat fuzzy about where the agent is and where the resources are that are assigned to it. But I think that sort of fits in the broader idea of setting up boundaries in such a way, right? Roles and boundaries to get to more cooperative outcome, right? And so to the extent that this paper that I didn't talk about gives a high level message, it's maybe that in some cases you want to set up this kind of interdependence, right? That you, if any agent tried to take advantage of another one, they would be able to quickly be punished by the other agent for that. And yeah, but I think there's also a whole lot more to be done there.
Cool, thank you very much. Yeah, I think this is probably a good time to wrap up. Yeah, don't see any other questions. Thank you so much for your time, Vincent. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, good luck with your work going forward.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Yeah, if you have more
questions,
please feel free to send them over.
That's great. Cool. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Okay.
Bye.